Thank you, Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Greens to speak on the Firearms Legislation Amendment Bill 2022 and put on the record the fact that the Greens oppose this piece of legislation. When we were briefed last week by the government in relation to this piece of legislation, it sounded very much like this was an attempt by the government to weasel around what were determinations made by NCAT to suggest that certain firearms should actually be prohibited. And in actual fact, what they're doing now is moving, as they did in regulations, and now moving into legislation attempt to work around this NCAT decision. Now, that is not a good approach. What we recognise here, and what was quite disturbing to me and I think others that were in that briefing when we heard the reasons for this, was the simple fact, and it's on the record in the Minister's second reading speech, this is all about removing barriers and unnecessary regulatory burdens faced by pest controllers and farmers with Category D licences. I think we would all agree the kinds of weapons that we're talking about here, the Category D licences, the last thing we want to be doing is removing barriers and regulatory oversight of the use of such weapons. It's one thing to say that there are certain purposes for certain weapons in certain circumstances, but it's a whole other thing to start making it easier by reducing the barriers, removing, if you like, the red tape around people being able to use such weapons. And I think it's important for us to realise, in the context of what occurred back in the 2020 NCAT decision, that it was determined, and as a result of that determination, that certain 6-Corp model KS30 Category D firearms were prohibited firearms under the Item 5 of Schedule 1 of the Act by virtue of being a self-loading centre-fire rifle of a kind that is adapted or designed for military purposes. Now, applying this broad interpretation resulted, and I think we all agree, and we've heard people here, in about 175 Category D licence holders becoming potentially, in possession of now prohibited firearms. Now, there are solutions to that problem. If there was a view that NCAT believed that there was a reason to take that, the solution could have been that the government engaged in a process of an amnesty and a buyback scheme to be able to address that small problem. The solution is not to turn around and say, oh, well, actually, NCAT determined that this is a dangerous weapon that should be excluded, of a kind that is used for military purposes and therefore should be prohibited. The solution is to not turn around and then change the regulations and change the law to allow that firearm to be used, but instead is to turn around and look at how we make sure that we are keeping our community safe and not going through a process which sadly we have seen over decades now in New South Wales, in other states and across the country, a weakening of gun laws. And maybe it's because, the rise of the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party in the presence in this chamber makes those in the government benches feel like they need to placate certain members of the crossbench, especially when the numbers are tight, and we all agree the numbers are tight right now. But let's be really clear, the Greens are not satisfied with anything that attempts to be a dangerous and backward approach when it comes to winding back protections around gun laws in this state. In addition to that, and I think it needs to be made really clear, that the suggestion that we saw through this process is that basically, it was an unintended, consequence. That basically, that this area was designed to prohibit the use of weapons around those designed for military or militia purposes. But in actual fact, in some cases, people are using them for other purposes that then might also be used by military or militia purposes. So therefore, that's okay. And we're now going to remove the red tape. We're going to remove the barriers and the regulatory requirements around that. And we're going to make it even easier for people to have these weapons. Now, I appreciate that people are going to go me as the member for Newtown that has no idea what we are talking about in relation to the regional challenges that people face. But I think that it is very, very clear, and the Greens have a very, very strong position, that when it comes to the winding back of regulations and controls over people using firearms in this state and in this country, we need to not cave in to the likes of the Shooters and Fishers and Farmers Party. We need to not cave in to the fact that the government is here right now, with not having the numbers in this chamber, we see the cosy relationship between some of the shooters and some of the opposition members in this place. We see in here the opposition, from what I can tell, lining up with the government on this reform, so-called reform. But it's actually not a reform at all. It's about weakening the protections of those in our community by removing the so-called barriers and regulatory measures as a result of an NCAT decision. The way this was presented, which was, we've always done this in regulation, we've done it twice, we renewed the regs, and now we're just putting it into legislation, fails to recognise the significance of what we've seen around the winding back of gun controls and gun laws in this state and in this country. In addition to that, and I think it's important to note, and I put this on the record and foreshadow that the Greens in the other place will be seeking to amend this legislation. There is absolutely no NCAT finding or other finding that would recommend or suggest that we remove the 12-month maximum licence period for Category D licences issued to primary producers involved in the eradication campaigns in Section 21(2) of the Act, and instead provide these licences can be issued for periods of 1, 2 or 5 years. That has nothing to do with the NCAT decision. This is yet again the New South Wales Liberal National Government attempting to appeal possibly to the shooters in this place because the numbers are tight. There was no requirement to do that. And I think that we need to remember here that what is happening is we are seeing the New South Wales Liberal National Government weaken our gun control laws in this state. We should be worried about that because we know that the shooters sit in a powerful position in the balance of power, both in this chamber and the other chamber, and it is a dangerous precedent to set, to be moving into a period where as soon as this federal election is finished, we will be focused on a state election, and to see the Liberal National Government coming in here while everyone's focused on what's happening federally and weakening further gun laws in this state.